In September of 9 AD, 3 Roman legions, 20,000 of the empire's finest soldiers, vanished into the German forests. According to multiple Roman historians, not one organized unit emerged. When news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus spent months wandering his palace, screaming quote underscore 0 underscore. This was the complete annihilation of more than 1/10 of Rome's entire army in 4 days of methodical slaughter. 20,000 professional soldiers, 3 complete legions. Historical records document these weren't recruits, but veterans of the Illyrian campaigns. Yet Cassius Dio records that, quote 1, the legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never used again. The only legions in Roman history erased from existence. By the end of this video, you'll understand how archaeological evidence and contemporary sources reveal the perfect storm that transformed an empire. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see ancient warfare. First, the 600-meter fortification discovered in 1987 that proved Germanic quote 2 built military engineering Rome would have respected. Second, why the architect of this catastrophe was a Roman cavalry officer who'd served Rome faithfully. Third, how Roman equipment, the pinnacle of military technology, became a fatal weakness in 4 days of rain. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did a Roman-trained officer convince a governor to march 20,000 soldiers into a kill zone? What intelligence failure allowed a conspiracy involving thousands to remain hidden? Why did elite cavalry abandon their infantry brothers? And how did terrain alone negate centuries of Roman tactical evolution? To understand how Rome's northern dream died in German mud, we need to step back to 12 BC, when Augustus decided the Rhine wasn't enough. The year 12 BC saw Augustus make a decision that would haunt Rome for generations. The Rhine River, which had served as a convenient frontier during decades of Gallic pacification, was no longer sufficient for imperial ambitions. Augustus envisioned a frontier not at the Rhine, but 200 miles east at the Elbe. A strategy that would create a shorter, more defensible border while incorporating the vast territory of Germania Magna into Rome's tax base. This wasn't mere territorial greed. Strategic logic suggested that pushing the frontier eastward would reduce the length of border requiring military defense, freeing up legions for deployment elsewhere. For nearly 2 decades, Roman armies under Drusus and then Tiberius conducted what sources describe as systematic campaigns, building forts, crushing resistance, creating the infrastructure of control. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of this investment. At Haltern, Oberraden, and Anreppen, excavations have revealed substantial Roman fortifications designed for permanent occupation, not temporary campaign bases. These weren't frontier outposts, but administrative centers intended to govern a Roman province. By 7 AD, the Roman administration believed the region was ready for transition from military zone to formal province. Cassius Dio records that Germanic tribes were becoming accustomed to Roman markets and were holding peaceful meetings. The signs, Romans believed, of successful pacification. The tribes attended Roman organized assemblies. They traded with Roman merchants. Young warriors from noble families served in auxiliary units, learning Roman discipline and tactics. To Roman eyes, Germania was following the same path as Gaul had generations before, from conquest to cooperation to civilization. Augustus appointed Publius Quintilius Varus as governor, a man whose career embodied administrative excellence. His task was clear: transform Germania Magna from conquered territory into tax-paying province, implement Roman law, establish courts, collect revenue. The military phase, Romans assumed, was complete. What remained was the bureaucratic work of empire building. But Cassius Dio's account contains an ominous qualifier that Romans either missed or dismissed. While adopting Roman customs, the tribes underscore 20 years of investment, dozens of fortified positions, thousands of Roman lives, massive treasury expenditure, all based on the assumption that Germanic tribal warriors could be governed like Syrian taxpayers. The forest was about to prove otherwise. Making Germania Roman required the right administrator, someone who understood how to transform military conquest into civilian prosperity. Augustus chose carefully. He chose a man whose name would become synonymous with catastrophic failure. The man Augustus chose to govern Germania couldn't have been more perfect. For the wrong province, Publius Quintilius Varus came from the highest echelons of Roman society. Born in 46 BC to a noble family, he'd watched his father commit suicide after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Following a family tradition his grandfather had established under similar circumstances. Political connections ran through his bloodline. His marriage to Claudia Pulchra, Augustus's grandniece, placed him within the imperial family itself. Consul in 13 BC, governor of Africa. Then the prestigious posting to Syria around 7 to 4 BC. Syria made Varus's reputation and his fortune. Velleius Paterculus, writing a generation later, noted with Roman wit that Varus _5_. His administration was efficient, profitable, and entirely suited to governing civilized, tax-paying populations. When Herod the Great died in 4 BC, leaving Judea in chaos, Varus managed the crisis with firm administrative control. He understood how to work with local elites, how to implement Roman taxation systems, how to establish courts that balanced Roman law with local customs. For an urbanized province with centuries of bureaucratic tradition, Varus was exactly what Rome needed. Contemporary sources describe him carefully. Velleius Paterculus. Quote 6. This wasn't incompetence. This was a specialist in the wrong specialty. Cassius Dio adds that Varus attempted to change the Germanic peoples as though they were slaves of the Romans, collecting taxes, establishing courts, imposing the same civil law that worked in Syria. For an urbanized province, this was governance. For tribal warriors, this was humiliation. Varus arrived in Germania in 7 AD with the same confidence that had served him in Syria, the certainty that Roman law, Roman markets, and Roman order could transform any people into citizens. He had no significant combat command experience. His expertise was administrative, not tactical. His instincts told him to treat Germania like Syria, implement taxation schedules, establish judicial procedures, integrate local elites into Roman power structures. He dispersed his soldiers in small detachments throughout the territory to guard provision trains, suppress brigands, and enforce tax collection. Standard practice for a pacified province. Catastrophic vulnerability in hostile territory. But Varus didn't see hostile territory. He saw the next Syria, the next success story of Roman administrative genius. When local leaders attended his assemblies, when they dined at his table, when they served as advisors on local affairs, he saw cooperation and civilization advancing. What he couldn't see was that his entire information network, every source of intelligence about tribal sentiment, every warning about potential unrest, ran through the very people planning his destruction. Across the Weser River, A man who understood both Roman order and Germanic fury was watching and planning. The man who would destroy 3 Roman legions was a Roman citizen, a Roman cavalry officer, a Roman knight. Arminius, prince of the Cherusci, was the ultimate product of Rome's hostage system, a program designed to create loyalty by educating tribal sons in Roman culture, granting them citizenship, giving them military commands so they'd govern their own people as Roman allies. Born around 17 BC to Segamarus, a Cheruscan chieftain, Arminius had been taken to Rome as a youth, learned Latin, studied Roman law and tactics, earned equestrian rank, a significant honor reserved for Rome's social elite. Velleius Paterculus himself describes Arminius as a, quote, "8 he'd served with distinction in the Illyrian campaigns from 6 to 9 AD, commanding Germanic auxiliary units under Roman officers." This wasn't theoretical military education. Arminius understood how Roman legions marched, how they constructed camps, how their signal systems worked, how their formations deployed, where their tactical doctrine was strongest and where it was vulnerable. He'd lived inside the Roman military machine for years. This duality was his weapon. Roman sources record that he dined regularly with Varus, served as his primary advisor on local affairs, was treated as a fellow Roman officer. Yet he'd married Thusnelda, daughter of Segestes, a rival Cheruscan chief, in defiance of her father's wishes, a thoroughly Germanic act of personal will over political expediency. To Romans, he was the success story of Romanization. To Germanic tribes, he was something more complex, a man who understood the conqueror from the inside, who knew exactly where Rome was vulnerable, who could turn Roman training into a weapon against Rome itself. Cassius Dio describes Arminius executing a deception throughout the campaign season, coordinating tribes that normally fought each other, creating false intelligence about minor uprisings to scatter Roman forces into vulnerable detachments. This was months-long operational planning, not spontaneous resistance. The Cherusci, Marsi, Bructeri, Chatti, Chauci, tribes with histories of mutual warfare, unified under Arminius's coordination. Each played a role. Each contributed warriors. Each understood that Roman power, seemingly invincible in open battle, could be negated by choosing the right terrain and the right moment. Throughout the summer of 9 AD, Arminius maintained absolute operational security. He attended Varus's assemblies. He provided tactical advice. He helped identify areas of unrest that required Roman military attention. Unrest he'd often orchestrated himself to justify dispersing legionary detachments across the territory. Every suggestion weakened Roman concentration. Every piece of intelligence isolated another cohort. And Varus, trusting his Roman-educated advisor, never questioned why his army was spreading thinner and thinner across Germania's forests. By summer's end, Arminius had achieved what no Germanic leader before him had managed: a coordinated coalition of traditionally feuding tribes, unified by a common target. He understood Roman tactics better than most Roman officers. He knew Varus's blind spots. He'd identified the terrain where Roman superiority would become Roman suicide. All he needed now was to get 20,000 Romans to walk into the trap. And for that, he needed one final deception. On the eve of the Roman departure from their summer camp, one man tried to prevent the catastrophe. Velleius Paterculus records that Segestes, a Cheruscan chieftain and ironically Arminius's own father-in-law, came to Varus with an urgent warning: arrest the Germanic leaders, all of them, including Arminius. A conspiracy was afoot. The scale wasn't specified, but Segestes claimed to have proof. immediate preventive action could avert disaster. Varus's rejection, documented in sources, was entirely reasonable by Roman logic. Segestes and Arminius were rivals. Segestes opposed his daughter's marriage to Arminius, resented his growing influence among the tribes. Personal feuds between tribal leaders were common. Of course, Segestes would try to discredit his son-in-law. Why would Varus believe a tribal chieftain over a Roman knight who'd served the empire faithfully for years? Arminius had fought in the Illyrian campaigns. He'd commanded auxiliary units with distinction. He'd earned equestrian rank through merit and service. His loyalty was proven by action, not just words. Here's the intelligence failure that doomed 20,000 men. Varus's entire information network in Germania came through Romanized Germanic leaders, the same leaders Arminius had spent months recruiting or neutralizing. No independent source of intelligence existed. No Roman spy network operated independently of local collaborators. Varus had no way to verify or contradict the information Arminius provided. His Syrian experience had taught him that Romanized local elites were trustworthy allies, that men educated in Rome and granted citizenship served the empire's interests. In Syria, this assumption held true. In Germania, it was lethal. Cassius Dio describes Arminius's final deception. Reports of a revolt in the northwestern reaches of Germania requiring immediate attention. Not a major uprising that would justify calling for reinforcements from the Rhine. Just enough unrest to justify changing routes, to take what Arminius described as a shortcut through the forests to suppress the disturbance before it spread. Speed mattered, Arminius argued. Catch the rebels before they could organize. Demonstrate Roman power through swift response. Varus made his choice. Trust the Roman knight over the tribal rival. Take the shortcut. Suppress the revolt efficiently. The legions would march at dawn. And Arminius, requesting permission to rally allied Germanic forces to assist with the pacification, rode ahead into the forest, ostensibly to help, actually to command the ambush forces waiting in the trees. Segestes' warning went unheeded. The conspiracy remained unbroken, and 20,000 Romans began the march that would erase them from history. The morning of September 9th, 9 AD, dawned gray and cold as 20,000 Romans began their march into annihilation. Cassius Dio describes a Roman army on the march as an entire mobile society. Not just the 15,000 to 18,000 combat troops, but thousands of non-combatants. Modern historians, calculating from standard Roman column formation, estimate this mass stretched between 7 and 12 miles when forced through narrow forest paths. Merchants hoping to profit from the campaign, craftsmen maintaining equipment, servants attending to officers, soldiers' families traveling to winter quarters, 10,000 or more pack animals carrying everything from tents to artillery pieces. In proper terrain, this worked. The column could deploy into defensive formation if threatened. But here, stretched through dense forest, the Romans were creating their own vulnerability with every step. The Kalkriese corridor, though Romans didn't know its name, represented the perfect ambush terrain. Archaeological surveys reveal the geography that doomed them. Ancient forest dense enough to block the sky, the great bog extending impassably to the north. Kalkriese Hill rising to the south. At the narrowest points, the passage was barely 220 meters wide. Think about the mathematics. A 12-mile-long column funneled into a space the width of 2 football fields. Every meter of that Roman column, stretched over miles, would have to pass through this bottleneck. Cavalry couldn't maneuver. Infantry couldn't deploy into formation. Artillery became useless burden. Cassius Dio's account becomes visceral here. A violent rain and wind came up that separated them still further, while the ground that had become slippery around the roots and logs made walking very treacherous for them, and the tops of the trees kept breaking off and falling down, causing much confusion. The storm wasn't a brief squall, but sustained assault. Rain so heavy it reduced visibility to a few dozen meters. Wind strong enough to break branches from ancient trees. Ground transforming from firm forest floor to treacherous mud where roots became tripwires and logs became obstacles. The attacks came from everywhere and nowhere. Cassius Dio describes the Germanic tactic. Warriors would approach the column, launch javelins from dense forest cover, then retreat before the heavy Roman infantry could engage. Quote 11, hit and run. Appear, attack, vanish. The Romans, trained for formation combat where discipline and superior equipment dominated, found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to stand still. Cavalry tried to pursue attackers into the forest, but thick undergrowth and fallen trees made mounted pursuit impossible. Heavy infantry attempted to form defensive lines, but the narrow paths and continuous column prevented proper deployment. Then the scouts stopped returning. The first one, sent at dawn to survey the route ahead, simply vanished. No body, no horse, no sign of struggle. A second patrol, 5 men, rode out at midday. One horse returned at dusk, riderless, saddle-caked with frozen blood. The third reconnaissance, 20 veterans, found only disturbing marks in the snow and the overwhelming sensation of being watched from every shadow. Standard Roman reconnaissance doctrine was failing. The information Varus needed to make tactical decisions, what lay ahead, where the enemy concentrated, which routes remained open, wasn't reaching him. As visibility dropped and attacks intensified, Roman discipline asserted itself despite the chaos. The legionaries did what they'd been trained to do since recruitment. They built a fortified camp for the night. Complete entrenchment, palisade walls, organized layout, a testament to training that functioned even in nightmare conditions. But the morning would bring no relief. The storm was only beginning. And ahead, invisible in the rain and mist, lay the prepared killing ground that would break Roman military supremacy forever. Day 2 dawned with a discovery. There would be no dawn. The storm had turned the forest into permanent twilight. Cassius Dio records the Roman strategy for the second day. Quote 12, mobility over supply, survival over comfort. The objective was clear. Reach open ground where legion formations could deploy, where cavalry could function, where Roman tactical superiority meant something. But the forest seemed endless, and the attacks never stopped. Here's where Roman military superiority inverted into liability. Cassius Dio describes it precisely. The barbarians, being for the most part lightly equipped, suffered far less from the storm, and they could approach and retire easily, and could inflict damage without receiving any. The equation was brutal. Germanic warriors in simple leather or no armor moved freely through terrain, where Roman legionaries in mail shirts, carrying large shields and heavy equipment, struggled with every step. The rain that made Roman footing treacherous barely affected warriors who knew every route, every path, every hidden approach through forests they'd hunted since childhood. The baggage train's abandonment marked desperation. Every wagon left behind was an admission that the situation had deteriorated beyond standard campaign difficulties. These weren't supply carts that could be recovered later. They contained food, medical supplies, artillery pieces, personal belongings of 20,000 people. Abandoning them meant accepting that survival depended on speed, not sustainability. The pack animals, exhausted and terrified by constant attacks, were released or killed. Their screams added to the chaos as Germanic warriors harvested easy targets. The equipment failure accelerated through day 2. Roman composite bows, engineered for power and accuracy, required dry conditions. Moisture penetrated the laminated wood and horn construction, weakening the adhesives that held layers together. Bowstrings absorbed water, stretched, lost tension. By afternoon, Roman archers found their weapons increasingly ineffective. Without covering fire to suppress Germanic positions, without ranged response to javelin volleys, Romans couldn't create the tactical breathing room needed for organized movement. Casualties mounted in a pattern that defied Roman military experience. Sources don't provide specific counts for day 2. Such detailed accounting disappeared with the men who maintained it. But the accumulation is documented. Wounded soldiers, unable to keep pace with the column, were left behind. Germanic warriors gave them no mercy. The screams of dying men echoed through the forest, a psychological weapon as effective as any javelin. Morale, the intangible force that kept armies fighting when logic suggested surrender, began to crack. A second night camp, smaller than the first, tighter perimeter, less equipment, more wounded, fewer rations. The professional facade of Roman military discipline remained intact. But beneath it, veterans who'd fought from Syria to Pannonia understood they were in a situation without historical precedent. Rome's legions didn't get trapped in forests. They didn't abandon their supplies. They didn't suffer continuous casualties without inflicting reciprocal damage. Yet all of this was happening, and ahead lay terrain that would prove even worse. The Kalkriese Narrows, where the Germanic coalition had spent weeks preparing something unprecedented in barbarian warfare. A fortification, 600 meters of engineered death. Day 3 brought the Romans to a bottleneck that would become, 1,978 years later, the smoking gun of premeditation. The Kalkriese Narrows, a name the Romans never knew, represented the tactical climax Arminius had planned for. Modern archaeological surveys document the geography. Kalkriese Hill rising to the south, the great bog extending impassably to the north, and between them, a passage that narrowed to barely 220 meters at critical points. Every meter of that Roman column, stretched over miles, would have to pass through this funnel. There was no alternative route. The bog meant instant death for anyone attempting to bypass. The hill was too steep for heavily equipped infantry to climb while under attack. But here's what makes this more than tactical opportunity. Here's what proves this was engineered slaughter, not spontaneous ambush. In 1993, archaeologists excavating the Kalkriese site discovered something that rewrote assumptions about Germanic military capability. A 600-meter-long rampart. Not a defensive border wall, but a tactical structure. Sand and turf construction, topped with wooden palisade, positioned precisely to protect Germanic warriors as they rained projectiles onto the Roman column trapped in the narrow passage below. This wasn't improvised tribal warfare. This was systematic military engineering. Archaeological analysis reveals what this construction required. Weeks of preparation, hundreds of laborers, unified command structure to coordinate the work, engineering knowledge to position it for maximum tactical effect. The rampart ran along the southern edge of the passage, elevated enough to provide commanding position, but low enough for rapid construction. 3 to 4 feet high. But that elevation combined with the downward angle created perfect throwing positions. Warriors protected behind wooden palisades could launch javelins, spears, and stones without exposing themselves to return fire. The tactical function was brutally simple. Germanic warriors, protected behind the rampart, could hurl projectiles down onto the Roman column trapped below. The Romans, confined between bog and fortified hill, couldn't deploy into formation, couldn't bring cavalry to bear, couldn't even effectively fight back uphill against an entrenched enemy. Archaeological excavations at the rampart site recovered thousands of projectile points, javelins, spears, stones, concentrated in a zone suggesting coordinated, sustained volleys rather than scattered individual attacks. Combined with Cassius Dio's descriptions of Germanic tactics, this suggests a rotation system. Warriors throwing, retreating to rearm, fresh warriors stepping forward, creating continuous rain of death. The discovery of a silver-plated cavalry face mask, parade armor of an elite officer, at the base of the rampart tells a story of desperate assault. Senior Roman cavalry officers, perhaps recognizing the tactical necessity of silencing that position, led charges uphill. The mask's location suggests how those charges ended. Think about the mathematics. 220 meters of passage, thousands of Romans trying to pass through simultaneously. No room for the standard Roman formation, the triple-line deployment that made legions invincible in open battle. No space for cavalry to maneuver around flanks. The bog to the north meant instant death for anyone trying to bypass. The fortified hill to the south meant uphill assault into entrenched positions. The Romans approaching on that gray morning in September 9 AD had no idea this fortification existed. No scouts had returned to report it. No intelligence had warned them. As the vanguard entered the narrows, they saw what looked like natural terrain. Hill on one side, bog on the other, a difficult but passable route. Then the first volley came from the rampart they couldn't see, and the mathematics of slaughter began. The first Germanic warrior rose from behind the rampart, javelin already in throwing motion. Then a second, then 100. Then the sky disappeared behind iron. Cassius Dio describes the arrow storm in language that sounds exaggerated until you calculate the mathematics. 10,000 archers could launch 12 arrows per minute, creating 120,000 projectiles in the air within the first few minutes. But these weren't just arrows. Germanic warriors threw heavier javelins and spears, weapons designed to punch through shields and armor at close range. Stones the size of fists, launched from slings or simply thrown from elevated positions, rained down with bone-breaking force. Archaeological excavations at the rampart site provide brutal clarity about what happened here. The density of Roman artifacts, coins, weapons fragments, equipment pieces, personal items, exceeds any other location on the battlefield. This wasn't just another engagement in the running battle. This was where the majority died. The concentration tells a story that ancient texts can only hint at. Thousands of men trapped in a space barely wider than 2 modern city blocks, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to deploy the formations that made Roman infantry supreme. The Romans attempted to break through. They had no choice. Forward was the only direction that offered any hope. Some units tried to charge the rampart uphill, hoping to close with the enemy and silence those throwing positions through close combat where Roman training and equipment should dominate. The silver-plated cavalry face mask found at the rampart's base marks one such attempt. An elite officer, the kind who wore parade armor worth more than a common soldier's annual salary, led his men up that slope. Whether he died from javelin, stone, or in hand-to-hand combat at the palisade, archaeology cannot determine. Only his mask remains, dropped or torn from his corpse, buried in the mud where he fell. Think about the impossibility of the Roman position. Cassius Dio describes attempts to fight back, but the geometry defeated every effort. Romans trying to throw javelins uphill at entrenched targets behind wooden palisades faced terrible odds. Most throws fell short or struck wood rather than flesh. Germanic warriors, throwing downhill at tightly packed targets, could hardly miss. Even random throws into the trapped column below had reasonable chance of hitting someone. The mathematics of elevation, of target density, of protected versus exposed positions. Every calculation favored the Germans. For hours, the killing continued. Romans died by the hundreds in that narrow corridor, their bodies creating obstacles for those behind them, their blood mixing with rain and mud, until the passage itself became a river of red. Wounded men, unable to stand, were trampled by their own comrades as the column tried to push forward. Horses, maddened by pain and terror, threw their riders and scattered in panic. Crushing infantry in narrow confines. The professional Roman war machine, disciplined across hundreds of battles, began to break down into chaos of individual survival. The archaeological record provides another chilling detail. The distribution of artifacts suggests multiple quote _ 14 of desperate activity rather than one continuous flow. This indicates that the Roman column didn't move steadily through the narrows, but instead bunched up, surged forward in desperate rushes, then stalled under withering fire. Each pause allowed more javelins to find targets. Each surge pushed men over the bodies of those who'd fallen in the previous attempt. The Germanic rampart, positioned to cover the entire passage length, ensured that there was no safe ground, no respite, no moment when Romans weren't under attack. And then something unprecedented in Roman military history occurred. The cavalry, Rome's elite, drawn from noble families, trained since childhood, made a decision that would stain their honor forever. They abandoned the infantry and ran. Velleius Paterculus, writing 20 years after the battle, recorded an act so shameful he could barely bring himself to detail it. Quote 15. This isn't historical interpretation or reconstruction from fragmentary evidence. This is explicit testimony from a contemporary Roman military officer who served in Germania. The cavalry fled, abandoning their infantry comrades, attempting to save themselves by reaching the Rhine frontier. Understanding who the cavalry were makes this betrayal even more significant. Roman cavalry came from the equestrian class. Wealthy families, political connections, men with resources and futures beyond military service. The infantry they abandoned were common citizens, men who owned little beyond their equipment. When the nobles fled, they weren't just abandoning comrades. They were confirming every suspicion common soldiers had about aristocratic self-interest. In a military culture built on mutual dependence, where cavalry protected infantry flanks and infantry anchored cavalry charges, this abandonment violated fundamental codes. The tone of Velleius's account, terse, almost reluctant, suggests the depth of shame this act carried. Roman military honor demanded standing with your unit. Cavalry abandoning infantry violated principles drilled into every soldier from the first day of training. The few cavalry who actually reached Roman lines would have carried this stain for life. Their families would have felt the social disgrace. Small wonder the legions, 17, 18, and 19, were never reformed. The dishonor contaminated even the numbers themselves. Velleius's account implies what Germanic tactical planning confirms. The escape attempt largely failed. Arminius had planned for this moment, positioned units along every route to the Rhine, specifically to intercept deserters. Most of the cavalry never reached Roman lines. Their speed bought them nothing except dying alone rather than in formation. The few who escaped did so through individual flight through the forest. Not organized withdrawal. They survived not through valor, but through abandoning everything: their honor, their comrades, their equipment, to save their lives. The infantry, watching their cavalry support disappear into the forest, understood immediately what this meant. No flanking protection, no shock troops to break enemy formations, no mobile reserve to exploit openings or cover retreats. They were alone, on foot, in terrain that negated every tactical advantage Roman training provided. Veterans who'd fought from Syria to Pannonia recognized this as a death sentence. Yet Roman discipline, that intangible quality that separated legions from mobs, held. The infantry didn't break and run. They didn't surrender. They prepared for the final hours with grim professionalism. With the cavalry gone, the infantry faced day 4 alone. Surrounded, exhausted, their equipment failing in ways that would have seemed impossible days before. The Scuda that had protected Rome's soldiers from Britain to Parthia were about to betray them at the most critical moment. The Roman scutum, 3 feet of curved wood, leather, and iron, had protected legionaries in 1,000 battles. In the rain-soaked forests of Germania, it became a death sentence. Cassius Dio provides the specific detail that explains tactical collapse. Quote 16, the Roman legionaries' primary defense, the large rectangular shield that could protect from knee to shoulder, was betraying the men who depended on it. Modern engineering analysis suggests a waterlogged scutum could double in weight from approximately 20 to 40 pounds. Think about holding that at arm's length while trudging through mud under continuous projectile attack. The leather and canvas covering that gave the shield its protective surface, absorbed water like a sponge. The wooden core, despite oil treatment, took on moisture through any crack or damaged section. Every hour in the rain added weight until the act of holding the shield became as exhausting as fighting itself. Roman composite bows, engineered for power and range, required dry conditions to function. Cassius Dio notes that bowstrings underscore quote underscore 17 underscore. The carefully laminated construction, layers of wood, horn, and sinew bonded with animal glue, began to delaminate in wet conditions. Glue softened, layers separated, power dropped, range decreased. By day 4, Roman archers couldn't suppress Germanic positions, couldn't create covering fire for assaults, couldn't inflict casualties at distance. Every engagement became close combat in conditions where Germanic light equipment dominated. The armor that had saved Roman lives in countless battles became an exhausting burden. Mail shirts holding water added pounds to already heavy loads. Segmented armor required constant adjustment as leather straps stretched when wet. Helmets channeled rain directly into faces. Every piece of protective equipment that had seemed essential days before now felt like deliberate torture. Meanwhile, Germanic warriors in simple leather or no armor at all moved freely through the forest, unencumbered by the sophisticated military technology that was supposed to guarantee Roman superiority. Cassius Dio's account captures the cascading nature of the crisis. Not one thing failed, everything failed. Shields useless, bows silent, armor exhausting, supply wagons abandoned, wounded multiplying, food running low. Each problem compounded the others until Roman military superiority existed only in memory. The tactical doctrine that had conquered from Spain to Syria, heavy infantry in tight formation, supported by missile troops and cavalry. Deploying superior equipment through disciplined maneuver, required equipment that functioned and terrain that permitted deployment. In the Teutoburg Forest, Romans had neither. By the morning of day 4, the storm reached its crescendo. Roman equipment had completely failed. Roman tactical doctrine no longer applied. Roman military superiority was a memory from a different world. What remained were isolated pockets of desperate men whose only advantage was discipline and the certain knowledge that surrender meant torture and ritual death. The final positions were about to be overrun. The fourth dawn revealed what remained of 3 Roman legions, isolated groups, perhaps dozens to hundreds of men in each, forming defensive circles in the mud. Sources describe the fragmentation, but not specific positions. Archaeological evidence suggests multiple sites of final resistance, each surrounded and reduced separately. The running battle's final phase left survivors scattered across miles of forest in isolated pockets. No unified defense was possible. Each group faced annihilation alone. Why continue fighting when defeat was certain? Roman military culture provides the answer. Surrender to Germanic tribes meant torture, ritual sacrifice to their gods, dishonor worse than death. Tacitus's later description of the battlefield confirms this fear was justified. Altars where Roman officers were sacrificed, heads nailed to sacred trees. Better to die sword in hand than knife on altar. This wasn't irrational desperation, but calculated choice based on cultural understanding of what capture meant. Cassius Dio records that the storm intensified to its worst on the final day. Rain so heavy it reduced visibility to a few meters. Wind breaking branches overhead. Cold that made wounded men hypothermic within minutes of falling. Nature itself conspired in the annihilation, as if the German forests were rejecting Rome's presence. The Romans who'd marched confidently into Germania 4 days earlier now huddled in defensive circles, watching the forest for the attack they knew was coming. The final phase was systematic elimination. Germanic coalition forces, coordinated despite being multiple tribes, reduced each Roman pocket in turn. Valius's account is stark. Quote, 18. Cassius Dio confirms, quote, 19. The mathematics are brutal. Of approximately 20,000 soldiers, perhaps fewer than 1,000 survived. Most of those only by individual escape through the forest, not organized withdrawal. No intact units, no organized retreat. Just scattered individuals who managed to slip through Germanic lines and flee west toward the Rhine. For those who chose to stand, the end came in waves of coordinated assault. Germanic warriors, seeing victory certain, could afford patience, surround each pocket, launch volleys to wear down defenders, wait for exhaustion and wounds to do their work, then overrun the position when resistance collapsed. Some Romans maintained formation until the final moments, shield walls holding even as men dropped from wounds and exhaustion. Others broke earlier, combat devolving into desperate individual struggles. Archaeological evidence shows both patterns. Some sites with artifacts suggesting organized final stands, others with scattered remains indicating chaotic last moments. Across the killing grounds, isolated groups of Romans died by the hundreds. Centurions died beside their men. Veterans who'd fought from Syria to Britain died in German mud. The discipline that had made Rome's legions the most feared military force in the known world held until the very end. But discipline without equipment, without terrain, without hope, could only delay the inevitable. In one final pocket, surrounded by his remaining officers and guards, Publius Quintilius Varus faced a decision his father and grandfather had made before him. A decision that would echo through Roman history as the only honorable choice left. 3 generations of Quintilius Varus men faced impossible military situations. 3 generations made the same choice. Valius Paterculus explicitly connects Varus's death to family precedent. Varus, following the example of his father and grandfather, took his life with his own hand. His grandfather had committed suicide after backing Pompey against Caesar in the civil wars. His father had fallen on his sword after the defeat at Philippi in 42 BC. For the third, Quintilius Varus, suicide wasn't desperation. It was family tradition, Roman honor, and the only choice that preserved dignity. Most of Varus's senior officers followed his example. This wasn't mass panic, but deliberate Roman military culture. Tribunes, young men from senatorial families sent to gain military experience, chose death over the shame of capture. Senior centurions, career soldiers who'd served for decades, took their own lives rather than provide entertainment for Germanic celebrations. The officer corps died by their own hands, maintaining control over their deaths, if nothing else. For Roman aristocracy, suicide in the face of unavoidable defeat was honorable. Capture and execution was shameful. Cassius Dio provides the grotesque detail. Varus's body was discovered by Germanic warriors who severed the head. Arminius sent it to Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni tribe, a powerful Germanic leader who had remained neutral in the coalition. Maroboduus, wanting to prove his non-involvement to Rome, sent the head onward to Augustus. The governor, who'd failed to protect Germania, arrived in Rome as a severed head in a box. Physical proof that this wasn't rumor or exaggeration, but verified catastrophe. The head's journey carried symbolic weight beyond personal tragedy. Varus was married to Augustus's grandniece. Family connection made disaster personal for the emperor. His death symbolized the failure of Augustus's entire Germanic policy. 2 decades of campaigns, massive investment, the dream of an Elbe frontier, all ended with a Roman governor's severed head. The personal and political collapsed into single gruesome artifact that would haunt Augustus for his remaining years. For the common soldiers who died with Varus, no such family traditions guided their final moments. Most fought until wounds or exhaustion dropped them. Some attempted surrender, only to discover Germanic warriors gave no quarter. The ritual that awaited captured officers was denied to common soldiers. They received simple battlefield death, quick or slow depending on their wounds. Their bodies would lie exposed in the forest for 6 years before Romans returned to bury them. The head's arrival in Rome in late September or early October carried a message more devastating than any military dispatch. 3 legions destroyed, 15,000 soldiers dead. Germania lost. The governor's severed head proved it wasn't rumor or exaggeration. This had actually happened. And the 72-year-old emperor who received that head would never recover. 6 years after the battle, Roman soldiers under Germanicus would discover what happened to the officers who didn't commit suicide. Tacitus, writing from accounts of soldiers who were there, describes what Germanicus's army found in 15 AD. There in the open were whitening bones, scattered or in heaps, according as men had fled or stood their ground. Fragments of weapons and limbs of horses were lying about, and in the neighboring groves were the barbarous altars at which they had slaughtered tribunes and senior centurions. The altars Tacitus describes were sacred sites for Germanic religious practice. Roman officers, tribunes from senatorial families, senior centurions who'd commanded for decades, were ritually sacrificed to Germanic gods in thanksgiving for victory. Their heads, sources suggest, were displayed on sacred trees, marking the groves as sites of divine favor. For the Germanic coalition, this victory required proper religious acknowledgement. Their gods, Wotan the All-Father, Donner the Thunderbringer, had delivered Romans into their hands. Sacrificing captured officers wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but religious obligation. The highest-ranking prisoners representing Rome's power, made the most valuable offerings. A tribune, son of a senatorial family, carried more spiritual weight than a common legionary. A senior centurion who'd served for 20 years represented more prestigious sacrifice than a new recruit. The ritual selection followed theological logic, not sadistic preference. Germanic religion demanded thanksgiving proportional to the victory granted. 20,000 Romans dead required substantial ritual acknowledgement. Archaeological evidence at Kalkriese confirms Tacitus's account. Bone pits contain remains showing violent trauma, sword cuts to skulls, evidence of blunt force. The whitening of the bones confirms they lay exposed for years before burial, exactly as Tacitus described. Some remains show patterns suggesting ritual treatment before death, binding marks on wrists and ankles, positioning that indicates ceremonial rather than battlefield killing. The physical evidence validates the textual account. This wasn't battlefield slaughter, but deliberate sacrifice. The discovery of these altars by Germanicus's soldiers 6 years later served dual purpose. For the living Romans, it explained the fate of comrades who disappeared. For the dead, it meant their deaths served Germanic religious purposes, becoming part of tribal spiritual narrative. The heads mounted on sacred trees would remain there until natural decay removed them. Constant reminder to Germanic peoples that their gods had granted victory over Rome. Physical trophies became spiritual validation. Tacitus's description emphasizes the underscore. Quote underscore 22 underscore nature of these altars, using language that reflects Roman cultural horror at human sacrifice. Yet the practice followed Germanic religious logic as systematically as Roman military doctrine followed tactical principles. Each culture had its codes. Each had its requirements. The collision in the Teutoburg Forest wasn't just military, but theological. Roman certainty of divine favor meeting Germanic proof of divine intervention. The altars stood as physical argument. The gods had chosen. In Roman military tradition, the loss of a legion's eagle wasn't just a defeat. It was a curse, a stain that could never be washed away. The aquila, the golden eagle on its wooden pole, wasn't just a battle standard, but the legion's soul. Held by the aquilefer, a senior soldier chosen for unquestionable courage, the eagle represented the legion's honor, history, and divine protection. Roman soldiers were taught from recruitment, you die before you let the eagle fall. The loss of one eagle was catastrophe. The loss of 3 was unprecedented in Roman military history. Sources don't document the precise moments when the 3 eagles fell. The aquilefers who held them died without survivors to record their final stands. But the logic is inescapable. As each legion's final pocket was overrun, as the last defenders fell, the sacred standards were torn from dead or dying hands. The man holding the eagle would have been among the last to die, surrounded by the fiercest fighters, protected until protection became impossible. When the eagle fell, the legion died. The 3 eagles were divided among the coalition tribes, evidence of Arminius's political skill in maintaining tribal unity. The Bructeri received 1 eagle, later identified as Legio 19. The Marsi held another. The Chauci from the North Sea coast kept the 3rd. No single tribe could claim sole credit for Rome's destruction. The spoils were shared, and so was the glory. This distribution prevented the internal conflicts that might have torn the coalition apart after victory. Each tribe possessed physical proof of participation in history's greatest defeat of Roman arms. For Augustus and his successors, recovering the eagles became more than military objective. It was spiritual necessity. The legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 remained cursed, unusable. The soldiers who died under those standards, unavenged. Future campaigns into Germania would be driven less by territorial ambition than by the need to reclaim these sacred objects and restore Roman honor. An eagle in Germanic hands was a daily reminder of Roman failure, a physical manifestation of the disaster that had shattered imperial confidence. The obsession with eagle recovery reveals how deeply the Teutoburg disaster wounded Roman pride. Other defeated legions were reformed under the same numbers. Other lost standards were written off as casualties of war. But the Teutoburg eagles were different. They represented not just military defeat, but the collapse of an entire strategic vision. Germania Magna, the Elbe frontier, the dream of northern expansion, all died with those 3 legions. The eagles became symbols of everything Rome had lost in those forests. Recovering them wouldn't restore Germania to Roman control, but it might restore Roman certainty that defeat was temporary, not permanent. 3 bronze eagles, 3 wooden poles, 3 sacred standards. Their loss represented 3 gaping wounds in Roman pride that wouldn't heal for decades. But before Rome could think about recovery, before planning revenge, the empire had to survive the immediate crisis. Because when news of the disaster reached Rome in late September, it triggered something close to national panic. Among the few Romans who escaped the forest was the Praefectus Castrorum, the camp prefect, a senior administrative officer. Reaching the Rhine frontier, he sent urgent dispatch to Rome. The message that arrived in late September was devastating in its simplicity. 3 legions destroyed, governor dead, Germania lost. Suetonius, Augustus's biographer, documents the emperor's breakdown with specific details that leave no doubt about the disaster's psychological impact. It is said that he was so greatly affected that for several months in succession, he would not cut his hair or shave, and would sometimes beat his head against a door, crying out, "Quintilivar, legiones redi, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The 72-year-old emperor, who'd spent 5 decades building the largest empire in Western history, was reduced to wandering his palace, screaming at a dead man to return what could never be returned. The hair and beard growing wild, traditional Roman sign of deep mourning. The physical violence of beating his head against doorframes, the desperate cry that would echo through Roman history. Cassius Dio describes security measures bordering on panic. A night watch was established throughout Rome, unprecedented in peacetime. Fear gripped the city that news of the victory might inspire Germanic or Gallic uprising within the empire itself. All Germanic and Gallic members of the imperial bodyguard were disarmed and expelled from the city. These were men who'd served loyally for years, but paranoia trumped trust. Magistrates had their terms extended to prevent any appearance of governmental instability. Rome locked down like a city expecting siege. The military crisis forced desperate measures. Cassius Dio records that the normal recruitment pool was exhausted. The Great Illyrian Revolt from 6 to 9 AD had already strained Roman manpower. Augustus ordered conscription of freedmen, normally exempt from military service. Elderly citizens beyond standard recruitment age were drafted. Those who resisted conscription faced execution or property confiscation. Rome was scraping the barrel for soldiers because more than 10% of its entire army had vanished in 4 days. Think about what 3 lost legions meant for imperial strategy. Not just 15 to 20,000 trained soldiers dead. Not just years of investment in training and equipment lost, but permanent gaps in the deployment roster. The Rhine frontier now desperately undermanned. Other frontiers potentially vulnerable. The empire had been operating on assumption of military superiority everywhere. The Teutoburg Forest proved that assumption false. Rome could be beaten. Germanic tribes, dismissed as barbarians incapable of sophisticated military operations, had engineered the most complete destruction of a Roman field army in imperial history. Augustus's cry, quote 24, wasn't just personal grief, but strategic desperation. Those legions represented specific strategic capabilities, specific frontiers defended, specific emperors' ambitions made possible. Without them, the entire Roman military calculus changed. Expansion became impossible. Defense became priority. The confident empire of Augustus's middle years transformed into the cautious, defensive empire of his final years. On his deathbed in 14 AD, 5 years after the disaster, his advice to his successor Tiberius was clear. Keep the empire within its present limits. The Elbe frontier dream died in the Teutoburg Forest. 6 years. The bones had been whitening in German weather for 6 years before Romans returned to bury them. In 14 AD, the year Augustus died, the new emperor Tiberius authorized his nephew Germanicus to lead campaigns into Germania. The mission had 3 objectives: punish the tribes who destroyed Varus's legions, restore Roman military prestige, and recover the 3 lost eagles. But first, Germanicus would do something Tiberius hadn't authorized. He would visit the battlefield and bury the dead. Tacitus, writing from accounts of soldiers who were there, provides a haunting description. Quote 25. The battlefield had become archaeological site, preserving the disaster in physical form. Bones whitened by 6 years of exposure to sun, rain, and snow. Weapons rusted and broken. Horse remains scattered where cavalry had fallen or been butchered. The quote 26 Tacitus mentions marked the sites of final stands, defensive circles where Romans had fought to the end, their bodies piling up as they fell. The quote 27 bones showed where individuals had attempted flight, dying alone in the forest. Tacitus records that Germanicus himself laid the first sod for the burial mound. This wasn't delegated to subordinates, but performed personally by the commanding general. The gesture was tactical, sharing in the army's grief, demonstrating that Rome hadn't forgotten its dead, that honor would be restored even 6 years late. The mass burial gave these soldiers what Roman tradition demanded: proper funeral rites in a marked grave. For 6 years they'd lain unburied, their spirits unable to find rest according to Roman belief. Now, finally, they received the dignitas death deserved. Tiberius's response was swift and critical. The emperor reprimanded Germanicus for performing the burial, arguing that seeing the physical evidence of Roman defeat would damage current troops' morale. The rebuke revealed deeper tensions. Tiberius, the cautious general, questioned whether Germania was worth more Roman blood. Germanicus, the aggressive commander, believed honor demanded revenge. This disagreement would shape Roman Germanic policy for the next generation. Tiberius would eventually halt the campaigns, accepting the Rhine as permanent frontier. Germanicus would die in 19 AD, still believing Germania could be conquered. The burial ceremony served dual purpose. For the dead, it provided proper funeral rites. For the living, it created closure, physical acknowledgement that the disaster had occurred, ritual that allowed moving forward. But the sacred eagles remained in Germanic hands. And for Germanicus, the campaigns of 15 and 16 AD would be defined not by territory gained or battles won, but by the recovery of those bronze standards that represented Rome's wounded pride. The hunt for the 3 eagles had begun. 32 years. That's how long it took Rome to recover its honor, one bronze eagle at a time. Tacitus records the first recovery in precise detail. Quote 28. The Bructeri had held the standard for 6 years. When faced with defeat in 15 AD, they attempted to burn their treasures. But Roman cavalry moved faster than flames. The first eagle came home. The second eagle came through intelligence rather than battle. Tacitus. Quote 29. Malovendus, a tribal leader who had submitted to Rome, revealed that one of the eagles was buried in Marsi territory, hidden in a sacred grove. Germanicus sent cohorts to recover it, based on this intelligence, and the standard emerged from 6 years of darkness in 16 AD. 2 eagles recovered in 2 years. 1 remained. The third eagle stayed in Germanic hands for a full generation. Cassius Dio records its final recovery in 41 AD, 32 years after the battle, during Emperor Claudius's reign. The eagle standard, which they had lost, was recovered by Aulus Gabinius Secundus, who defeated the Chauci. Men who'd been infants when Varus died were middle-aged when the last eagle came home. The recovery spanned 3 emperors: Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. Roman persistence across a generation proved that some symbols mattered more than practical strategic value. Each eagle's return was treated as a sacred event. The standards were restored to temples in Rome, honored as rescued divine objects. Religious ceremonies accompanied their installation. Sacrifices were made to thank the gods for returning what had been lost. The recovered eagles became pilgrimage sites for veterans, physical proof that Roman honor could be restored even after catastrophic defeat. But significantly, even after all 3 eagles were recovered, the legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never reused. The standards came home. The legion's honor was partially restored, but the curse remained. Those numbers belonged to the forest forever. Other legions that had been destroyed in battle were reformed under their old numbers. Military pragmatism usually overcame superstition. The Teutoburg victims were different. The disaster was too complete, the shame too deep, the psychological wound too severe. The numbers were erased from Roman military rolls, permanent reminder of what the forest had taken. 3 eagles returned, Roman honor partially restored. But Germania Magna, the province Augustus had dreamed of, the Elbe frontier Drusus had fought for, the territory Varus had died trying to govern, that was lost forever. The Rhine became Rome's permanent northern border, and that line, drawn in blood and bronze in the forests of Germania, would define European civilization for the next 400 years. 1 battle. 400 years of consequences. The Rhine River, which Augustus saw as temporary staging ground, became the edge of the Roman world till the empire itself fell. In 14 AD, 5 years after the disaster, Augustus died. Tacitus records his final advice to Tiberius: keep the empire within its present limits. The man who'd spent 50 years expanding Rome's borders died recommending consolidation over conquest. The Elbe frontier dream, 20 years of campaigns, countless lives, massive treasury investment, was officially abandoned. The Rhine would be enough. The Rhine transformed from temporary campaign line to permanent frontier, the Limes Germanicus. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale. Massive legionary fortresses at Vetera, Mogontiacum, Vindonissa, auxiliary forts every few miles, watchtowers providing continuous surveillance. This wasn't temporary deployment, but permanent militarization. 8 to 10 legions stationed permanently, nearly 1/3 of Rome's entire army, defending this single frontier for 4 centuries. The commitment of resources was staggering. 40 to 50,000 soldiers, supporting infrastructure, supply lines, administrative apparatus. All because the Teutoburg Forest proved that Germania couldn't be held. Tiberius's decision to halt Germanic campaigns after 16 AD wasn't surrender, but calculation. Germania Magna lacked the urban infrastructure and agricultural surplus that made provinces like Gaul or Syria profitable. Conquering and holding the region would require permanent subsidy from the treasury. Massive military garrison with minimal tax return. The cost-benefit analysis was brutal. Germania wasn't worth it. Better to fortify the Rhine and invest resources in provinces that could pay for themselves. Strategic realism replaced imperial ambition. The Rhine frontier contributed significantly to a cultural division still visible in modern Europe. West of the Rhine, Gaul became thoroughly Romanized. Latin evolved into French. Roman law shaped legal systems. Christianity spread through Roman infrastructure. East of the Rhine, Germanic tribal cultures persisted with less Roman influence. German, Dutch, Scandinavian languages maintained their roots. Tribal political structures evolved along different paths. Multiple factors created this divide. But the Rhine frontier's permanence reinforced and preserved these distinctions for centuries. The linguistic map of modern Europe still echoes the line drawn in 9 AD. French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, Romance languages descended from Latin, dominate west of the old Rhine frontier. German, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Germanic languages dominate east of it. 400 years of separation allowed these linguistic families to develop independently, creating patterns that persist 2,000 years later. The Teutoburg Forest didn't create this division by itself, but it made the division permanent by establishing a frontier that would last until the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Rhine frontier wasn't just a military line, but a civilizational boundary that persisted longer than most empires exist. Rome's northern dream died in the Teutoburg Forest. But the nightmare of that 4-day slaughter echoed for centuries. In the troops stationed on the Rhine, in the emperors who never again seriously attempted expansion beyond it, in the German tribes who remembered that Rome could be stopped. Arminius himself would be assassinated by members of his own tribe in 21 AD, feared for seeking kingship, unable to maintain the unity that had destroyed Rome's legions. Tacitus would memorialize him. Quote 31. The forest had spoken, and Rome, for once, listened. September 9th, 9 AD, 4 days, 3 legions, 20,000 Romans entered the Teutoburg Forest. Fewer than 1,000 emerged. It remains one of history's most complete military annihilations, not because of the casualty numbers, though those were catastrophic, but because of what those numbers meant. This wasn't Cannae, where Hannibal's tactical genius destroyed a larger Roman army. This wasn't Carrhae, where Parthian cavalry slaughtered legions in the desert. This was Roman military superiority systematically negated by a man who understood that system from the inside. Arminius didn't just defeat Rome. He weaponized Rome's own training against itself. Every tactical advantage Romans possessed, heavy armor, large shields, composite bows, disciplined formations, became a liability in terrain specifically chosen to neutralize those advantages. And here's what archaeology confirms that ancient sources could only hint at. This wasn't spontaneous tribal resistance. The 600-meter rampart at Kalkriese, discovered in 1993, proves this was an engineered military operation requiring weeks of preparation, hundreds of laborers, and unified command structure. Germanic quote 32 built fortifications that would have impressed Roman military engineers. The stereotype of unsophisticated tribal warriors died in the same forest where the legions did. But tactical sophistication doesn't explain the complete intelligence failure. How did thousands of Germanic warriors construct a 600-meter fortification without Roman scouts discovering it? How did Arminius maintain the conspiracy through an entire summer campaign season? The answer reveals intelligence warfare's eternal truth. The most dangerous threat comes from the insider you trust. Varus's entire information network ran through Romanized Germanic leaders, the same leaders Arminius had recruited or neutralized. Perfect operational security achieved not through secrecy alone, but through controlling what the enemy knew and believed. The Rhine remained Rome's northern frontier for 400 years. The cultural and linguistic division between Romance and Germanic Europe, still visible on modern maps, traces back to this battle. French exists because Gaul stayed Roman. German exists because Germania Magna didn't. The permanent stationing of 30% of Rome's army on the Rhine shaped imperial military strategy for centuries. Every emperor, after Augustus, understood there are limits to empire. And 3 legion numbers, 17, 18, 19, remain cursed, never reused in Roman military history, representing the only legions so completely destroyed that even their numbers died. For 2 millennia, the Teutoburg Forest battle existed primarily in Roman texts, accounts colored by shame, exaggeration, and propaganda. Then, in 1987, a British army major with a metal detector found Roman coins near Kalkriese. Professional excavations followed. The rampart emerged from the earth. Thousands of artifacts confirmed the ancient accounts. History became archaeology. The forest gave up its dead and validated its legend. Walk the Kalkriese site today. The rampart has been reconstructed. The forest still presses close, and you can almost hear what Roman scouts must have heard in those final moments. Not the ordered commands of legion. Warfare. Not the trumpet signals they'd trained to recognize, but something older and more terrifying. 20,000 soldiers, each one a person, someone's son, brother, father. Veteran legionaries who'd fought in Syria and Pannonia, young recruits on their first campaign, auxiliaries from distant provinces. They died in rain and mud, far from home, watching their equipment fail and their tactical superiority evaporate. 4 days of continuous slaughter in darkening forest. The efficiency of their annihilation remains breathtaking even 2,000 years later. The unstoppable force met the immovable object in those woods. For 4 days, the terrain, the weather, and the will of men who had made peace with death created something Rome had never faced. Defeat so complete, it changed imperial strategy forever. The forest stopped Rome. And that stopping point became the edge of civilization for 400 years.